really like this last section of chapter 1 because it gives us a chance to discuss the scientific process. It's for basic research scientists, it's very different from what you learn in elementary school, for example, or even maybe middle and high school. So let's backtrack though a little bit. The word science itself is actually derived from Latin, and it means to know, right? As humans, we are naturally curious individuals, right? We want to understand why am I predisposed to a certain disease? Why do I look the way that I look? Why are certain things happening the way that they are in the nature around me? And so inquiry is this search for information, explanations of natural phenomena. And as you've learned about the scientific process, you learned that it's made out of, several steps. This includes making observations, forming logical hypotheses, testing them through more observation or experimentation, and then analyzing, right, the results that you get so that you can see whether you can answer or help to support the scientific explanation that you were testing. Now, when we learn about science, again, in elementary school, middle school, the scientific method is usually a series of, 5 steps. When you go through steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, science is done, you're finished, complete. If only science were that easy. It'd be great. You want to get your PhD? Sure. Go through these 5 steps and you'll be done. Unfortunately, it's not like that. And this section from your textbook is really nice because it talks about some of the difficulties that come along with it, and it's not so straightforward as maybe we are initially taught in lower education. So we understand that being in a biology class, we're all going to be biologists, and the role of a biologist is to describe natural structures and processes that either occur in or relate to living organisms. And the way that we do this, the way that we learn about biology, is really based on observation and the analysis of data. Now, you've heard the term data before, and usually when people hear data, they immediately think numbers, graphs, charts, tables, things like that. There are different kinds of data, and we're going to stress 2 in this course. There's qualitative data, and then there's quantitative data. Qualitative data is often taken in the form of recorded observations or descriptions. So this could be a color change. Right? You can't put a number to a color change. You can't do statistical analyses on a color change, but it's still important data. It could be a drawing, a diagram, a video. These are all examples of qualitative data. And then there's also quantitative data. So quantitative data, this is where you have that idea of numbers, right? It's usually expresses numerical measurements. You can organize it into tables and graphs. You can do statistical analyses on quantitative data. In the lab part of this course, you will be running experiments where you will be looking at both qualitative and quantitative data, them being equally important. And just to give you an example, so this is a picture of Jane Goodall. She's a biologist who has dedicated her entire life to studying chimpanzees in the jungles in Africa. And you can see her here taking qualitative data, so taking photographs of these chimpanzees and making recordings of the behaviors that they go through. Now, she didn't just record qualitative data, she also recorded a lot of quantitative data. For example, when you're trying to get a feel for animal behaviors, certain behaviors, particularly repetitious grooming behaviors, oftentimes indicate that an animal is in distress or emotionally unwell. And so these are the things that I'm sure she spent some time studying during her time as a scientist. Super cool. If you haven't tried this before, you can actually use Google Maps to go into the Gombe jungle in Africa, and you can, using a little street view, see the house that Jane Goodall lived in while she was doing her research, and still goes to visit on occasion there in the jungle, and you can walk in there and everything, and it is pretty cool. So check it out if you haven't already. All right, so when we talk about the scientific method, typically we throw out the term hypothesis. What is a hypothesis? In science, a hypothesis is a tentative answer to a well-framed scientific question. So you're like, I wonder why this is happening. And you say, well, maybe it's because blah, blah, blah. That's your hypothesis. You don't know whether it's true or not, but you're using the background knowledge that you have to formulate a pretty good guess as to why this phenomenon might be happening. So it's usually a rational account for a set of observations. A hypothesis can lead to predictions that can be tested by making additional observations or by performing experiments. But usually the way we test a hypothesis to see if we can support it or if we can falsify it is by running experiments or making additional observations. And really, really important is that a hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable. You have to have a chance to determine whether you have data to support it or not. And one more piece that I'm going to add here, one of my biggest pet peeves in science classes, is that oftentimes students will say, oh, my experiment turned out really well. I proved my hypothesis. The thing is that you can never 100% without a doubt prove a hypothesis. All you can do in science is build more and more data to support it, to strengthen it, but you can never actually prove it. You can definitely falsify it. That's not a problem. But proving it is not possible. So think about the way that you word some of the conclusions for the experiments that you do during the semester. Remember, when you are talking about your hypothesis, you can say, I disproved my hypothesis, or I supported my hypothesis. Just don't use the term, I proved my hypothesis, because we can't do that. There's a nice little section in your textbook so you can read up more on that if you're not 100% convinced. So as I mentioned earlier, the scientific process is not just a series of 5 steps and you're done. It's much more complicated. It requires some backtracking, rethinking, and it maybe is symbolized a little bit better with this particular figure from your textbook. So you'll notice there are a couple bubbles. There's forming and testing a hypothesis, exploration and discovery, societal benefits and outcomes, and community analysis and feedback. And scientists spend time in each one of these circles, but it's not, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We might spend time in one circle, go back to a different one, and then jump ahead to the one on the right or go to the left. And so it's a lot more complicated. For example, let's say you make an observation. You say, wow, we really, as a scientific community, do not understand why this particular process is taking place. This is your exploration and discovery. You say, okay, I think this process is happening because of blah, 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 because of what I've read and other scientists have done. So you go through and you form your hypothesis. You form your hypothesis, and then you design some experiments to test it. But let's say the experiment that you need to do, you realize that you don't know the methodology. You don't know how to go through the procedure to actually collect your data. But you know of labs that have done this procedure before. So you email them, you call them, and you say, hey, I really want to learn how to do this particular procedure. Please teach me. You'll go to their lab. So this is community analysis and feedback. Maybe not whole community, but scientific community. You'll go to that lab, you'll get trained, you'll be able to get all your questions answered. You'll go back to your lab, you'll conduct the experiments, you'll collect your data. And as you sit down, you start to analyze it, you realize, wow, I'm still missing certain pieces to the puzzle. I can't really conclusively say that my hypothesis is supported because I'm missing this piece and this piece and this piece. So then you have to do a little backtracking and go and maybe read the literature, see what's already been done on these other little pieces to be able to combine that with the data that you've collected to come up with a concrete conclusion. Or maybe you realize, I've got a couple more experiments I need to do before I can use the data from this big experiment. So again, you'll go back, to explore, discover, come back and make some new, more specific hypotheses, test them, collect that data, revise things a little bit. And so you go back and forth until you finally have a good picture. You have some good data that supports a good hypothesis. And let's say it supports, the hypothesis that's supported is that you're testing a new drug for the treatment of atherosclerosis or heart disease. And you have good data to support that this particular chemical will help atherosclerosis patients. So now you've reached this part right here, societal benefits and outcomes. This drug could go then through FDA trials to see if it could be applied to society and help society in the treatment of heart disease. Once you get here, which is a great thing to get to when you're a scientist, right? Because that's what we want to do. We want to help society. Science doesn't stop there, right? You can still backtrack. Let's say that drug that you've discovered that helps atherosclerosis, well, guess what? There are molecules that play a role in the body in both heart health and cardiovascular health, as well as brain health. What if this drug that helps atherosclerosis could also help Alzheimer's patients? It's a really good hypothesis. What do you do next? Well, you go back here to the middle circle. You created a new hypothesis. Now you need to go back and you need to test it to see if you build data to support it, right? So there's a lot of movement through these different parts of the scientific process, going back and forth to achieve some sort of goal. And typically in science, when you answer one question, you bring up a gazillion more. And so really, that process will likely never end. There will always be people working on various fields in science trying to figure out the world around us. All right, now when I was younger, I decided I want to be a scientist. This is because I was really quiet. I did not like social situations. Speaking in front of a class was terrifying. I didn't raise my hand in class, and I thought, wow, a scientist, that's the perfect job for me, right? All you do is you sit at your bench, little lab coat, and you pour one chemical into another chemical, and that's it. You don't have to talk to anybody, and it's fantastic. Boy, was I wrong. Scientists work in teams. They're called labs, and these labs involve a lot of people, and you have to be able to communicate and work well together and be able to problem solve together. And when you do come to a point where you've discovered something fantastic, you have to be able to communicate it in a way that makes sense to other scientists and makes sense to the rest of the community. And so let's talk a little bit about what a lab looks like. Typically, a lab can be anywhere from 2 to maybe 50 people. On average, they're probably in the teens somewhere. A larger lab might be in the 20s. But typically, you'll have your professor. We call them the PI. PI stands for Principal Investigator. They're the boss, the head honcho. They're the individual that decides which direction the research will go. Under them, you have the postdocs. The postdocs are going to be mature scientists that are trying to find their sort of niche in the research field, right? They want to branch off. They want to create their own lab. They're still polishing their scientific skills. And they're also trying to maybe branch their project off from their PIs a little bit so they can go off and start their own lab. And then you've got the graduate students. These are the ones that are trying to attain their PhD or their master's degree. And so they're really learning that intensive scientific process. They're learning how to write papers. They're learning how to give presentations. And then you've got undergraduates, much like yourselves, who oftentimes will volunteer in labs or get fellowships over the summer to work in labs to gain that experience. I've even worked in labs where we've had some high school students that want to come in and want to volunteer to gain that experience. And then you've also got technicians, and technicians can be of any level. You can have technicians that have a high school diploma, bachelor's degree, master's, or even a PhD, but they like that technical level. They like managing the lab. They like running the experiments without any of the added maybe stresses of having to worry about writing grants and papers and things like that. And so this big team of people has to be able to function well to get the research accomplished, to be able to publish their information, because when you publish, people put value in your research, and people are then willing to give you money in the form of grants to continue your research because they believe in what you have discovered, identified, and they want you to continue the work that you're doing because they feel like it is important for society. And so it's really important to be able to communicate then the research that you complete and the conclusions that you make. And typically this is done through seminars. You have to give talks, you publish articles in scientific journals, and then also you can publish on websites as well.